Mostly it's a community in there, and it's a community that is delicately orchestrated for survival and growth and success. And I met a lot of beautiful people who I never would have had the opportunity to meet, certainly who came from much less privileged circumstances than I did.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Hi, so today we have another guest from overseas, which is incredible really that Zoom and Riverside and all these technologies enabled us to realise it's so much easier to do during the pandemic. But today we have Jeff Grant. For more than 20 years, Jeff served as managing attorney of a 20-plus employee law firm headquartered in New York City, representing family-owned and closely held businesses and their owners. I invited Jeff onto the podcast after reading his story in New Yorker. In 2001, after an addiction to prescription opioids, he committed a white-collar crime and served almost 14 months in a federal prison over the course of 2006 to 2007. When Jeff left prison, he started his own re-entry by earning a Master of Divinity, majoring in social ethics. After graduating from Divinity School, Jeff was called to serve at an inner-city church in Bridgeport, Connecticut, as Associate Minister and Director of Prison Ministries. He then co-founded Progressive Prison Ministries, Incorporated, the world's first ministry serving the white-collar justice community. And on the 5th of May this year, Jeff's law licence was reinstated by the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court of the State of New York. He's once again in private practice and is committed to using his legal expertise and life experience to benefit others. So really good to have you on and to get a different perspective today, Jeff. Thanks for agreeing to this.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, David. It's so wonderful to be with you.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and it's great to see you there in New York. Jeff, can you tell us something about how you went from being a successful lawyer to serving time in a federal prison?
Of course. I was a successful lawyer by probably anybody's definition. I had about 20 employees working for me. Not only did we do litigation and transactional work, but I was general counsel to a couple of large real estate organizations. And as general counsel, I was involved in the growth of their businesses and their transactions, and also, because they were family-owned real estate businesses, I was also involved in representing them as individuals. In at least one of the cases, there was a major white-collar issue that the owners had gone through. So I became very proficient in white-collar litigation, and we had hired a number of white-collar firms. So it was kind of foreshadowing what was going to happen with me. Of course, it was unexpected in a lot of ways. I was playing basketball with one of my clients, and I ruptured my Achilles tendon, and I became addicted to prescription opioids. At first for the pain, but then I had some well-meaning doctor friends who were willing to write me prescriptions on demand, mostly because I'm sure I manipulated them into it. And over the next 10 years, I became increasingly more addicted, and my drug use increased to the point where I could barely function as a lawyer. I couldn't show up for my firm, and so the receipts went down, the quality of the work went down, and I started having to make compromises. At some point, we ran out of cash, and I went to my office manager and demanded that she transfer money from the client escrow account into our operating account, which of course is unethical and illegal. We did it. Over her objection. And then it was just a countdown until I got caught, and my life had changed, but I didn't really understand it or know it because I was too desperate and too deep into my drug addiction. 9/11 happened. I took that very hard. My business got even worse as my drug use increased. And then I borrowed money from the government on an economic injury loan post 9/11, kind of the loans that are being given out in various countries, including Britain, for COVID, for COVID economic loss for businesses. Well, that was going on back then in the U.S. for 9/11, and I lied on the application and said I had a office close to Ground Zero, which I did not have. I did have conference space that I was using in another lawyer's office in the building that I claimed to have an office in. But and although I did not have use of that conference room, it had zero economic impact on my firm. So there was no question that I was lying because I was desperate and I wanted that money to save my business. I did not save my business, and the day came when it became clear I was going to lose my law license. I resigned my law license, and that night took my last. I got my last prescription of prescription opioids, and that night took the entire vial, trying to kill myself. And that was the end of my old life. I went to rehab, and then about 20 months later, I was arrested in relation to the 9/11 loan that I had made the misrepresentations on. And then in 2006, I reported to prison. So that's the short story of how I got from being a successful attorney to the prison door.
Thank you. I mean, it sounds like a whole constellation of terrible and unfortunate events. So what was it like for you being in prison? Did you meet people with a similar kind of background to you? How did you cope?
Well, most people who are imprisoned for white-collar crime in the U.S. go to a prison camp. And there are a lot of other white-collar criminals there, and people who have low-level drug offenses, and also people who have stepped down from higher security levels because they've just been in prison long enough that they've continued to step down, and that's their last stop before they are released. I was not afforded the ability to go to a prison camp. I went directly to a higher level security camp, mostly because of happenstance. It's not that I didn't qualify for the camp, but on the day that I was designated, there were no beds available in the camp. So it's kind of like, perversely checking into a hotel. Whatever's available that's the bedroom you get. And for me, I couldn't change my designation for a year. And since I was only going to be in prison for 13 or 14 months, there was no reason to seek a designation change. So I got there, and what I found was that there were 7 of us who would qualify as white-collar criminals. There was 1 former lawyer, that was me, 2 former doctors, and 5 former stockbrokers, and about 1,500 drug dealers of one sort or another. And it was a very difficult experience. Bars on the windows, controlled movement, everything that you can imagine or that you see on TV or in the movies about what a prison is. But in some ways, not that at all. Mostly it's a community in there, and it's a community that is delicately orchestrated for survival and growth and success. And I met a lot of beautiful people who I never would have had the opportunity to meet. Certainly who came from much less privileged circumstances than I did. And we talk about second chances for people, but most of these people never had a first chance. And so it was my first lesson in that kind of empathy and compassion and in becoming aware of the human condition in ways that I had never experienced before, and very, very valuable to me as a human. And then ultimately, as I went on to become a minister later, I think it informed all of those decisions.
Thank you. I really like that idea of the prison as a community. Actually, that I think gives one food for a lot of thought, really. So what was the impact on your family and your friends and your own social networks?
Well, I and we became pariahs immediately. We were radioactive. Nobody wanted to come near us. Some of it was because people don't know how to react or what to say to people who've been arrested or who've gone to rehab for drug and alcohol abuse. It's not in most people's realm of experience. Some people were just disappointed. Some people were frightened. Also, I was a lawyer who held a lot of people's secrets. And I'm certain that a lot of people were frightened that without my law license, that I might be inclined to share their secrets. Or perhaps I was so sick that I would betray their confidences, which wasn't the case, by the way. That never happened. But I can understand where people would be frightened of that. We decided that we had to move. We would have had to have moved anyway because I couldn't afford to live in the grand house we were living in the neighborhood we were living in. So we did move, and that dramatically affected my family and my children who were in school, notably my younger daughter who was just entering high school at the time. And so, of course, we moved from, as anyone whose brains were as scrambled as mine were, we moved from Rye, New York to one of the wealthiest communities in the country. We moved to Greenwich, Connecticut, home of the U.S. hedge fund industry. And because that's where I had started to go to recovery meetings. It was only 6 miles from our home. And we moved into an apartment there. And I lived in Greenwich for the next 15 years or so. So Rye and Greenwich, that whole area, for about 30 years. And as a family unit until my ex-wife kicked me out about 2 years later after my arrest.
So that sounds like a really difficult period. And from what you're saying, it seems as if all those friends and acquaintances that you knew, who you'd think would have a fairly sophisticated understanding of things, even they couldn't really grasp the issues behind your particular kind of offence, that they kind of lacked sympathy for you. Was that your experience?
You know, I don't know if they lacked sympathy, but they certainly weren't expressing it. They may have had internalized sympathy, but this was 20 years ago, so it wasn't as pervasive, and the topic wasn't as pervasive in the media. You know, I would say that people are much more open to the conversation now. You know, criminal justice is a conversation that's dinner table conversation now. It's talked about. It's in the media every day. Certainly, Whitecollar is as well, both in the U.S. and in the U.K. And I think that right now it's probably one degree of separation for most people to someone who has been imprisoned or is going through a criminal justice issue or a white-collar issue. But back then, it just wasn't talked about so much. And so I think I think people are going through it now. Certainly, it's one of my missions is to bring enlightenment and experience and wisdom and hope and faith to the experience for people who are going through it now. But I didn't have any of that back then. I didn't have any resources whatsoever. So we were in isolation. We went through it alone. So I understand why people did not come to help. And frankly, I was so full of shame that I wasn't reaching out for help either.
Yeah, I can imagine dealing with the shame must have been a massive issue for you and your family. And I'm thinking, of course, that addiction to prescription drugs is much more commonly thought about and talked about now than it was back then.
Yes. I think that it would be fair to call me an early victim of the opioid epidemic, but I would never consider myself to be a victim. And I wouldn't want in any way for anybody to think that I'm not accepting complete responsibility for my behavior and my crimes and what I did wrong. But pulling back a bit and looking at it, certainly the paradigm of overprescription, patient receiving opioids, whether or not there were incentives from from big pharma for doctors to be doing that in the 90s. It seems to have all been there, but I don't blame anybody for my behavior except myself.
Thank you, Jeff.
Do you think, Jeff, that we have a different attitude towards crimes that involve deception than we have towards other kinds of antisocial behaviour? So I was wondering if there's an assumption that violence, for instance, is triggered by context and circumstances. It's as if, or certainly professionals, I think, are willing to kind of like look at what the risk factors were that created the circumstances for violence. But I wondered whether there is an assumption that dishonesty is present there all the time, rather than recognising that actually that, you know, the fraud emerged again because of a period of crisis. I just wonder whether we're not as compassionate or understanding of white collar crime.
That could be the subject of an entire podcast, because we'd have to go into criminological factors and into social determinants of health in order to really unpack what the underlying reasons are, and then people's response to it. I think that there is generally more empathy and understanding and more resources now for people who have committed violent crimes or so-called inner city crimes. And part of that is an understanding that in many ways they are victims of their circumstances, of their socioeconomic circumstances. I think that generally there is less empathy and less support for people who have committed economic crimes, occupational crimes, fraud. I'm just putting labels to what white collar crime is generally. But I think when we go deep enough into the sociological factors, they're really kind of the same. Because for me, for example, I grew up with very limited parental supervision. Despite the fact that we lived in a fairly affluent suburb, my parents were absentee parents, and as children, we had to learn to parent ourselves. And so it's really not surprising that the building blocks of character were not there. And so I was able to be successful in an industry, law, but in a societal financial construct that supported my willingness to take risks, my willingness to play it as close to the edge as possible. But I didn't have the strength of character and the emotional maturity to know that, wait a second, I'm about to go over the line here, and that's too far. And I think that I find that in most of the people I work with, that they are somehow they have some form of arrested development of character. I think I don't want to blame anything or anybody for that, but over the last 150 years, we've certainly gotten away from ethics as our core competency and the core teaching that are, say, in university, for example, and we now have adopted maybe meaningless constructs like business ethics, where somehow they're designed to actually encourage people to embrace the kind of values that maybe the world is looking at a second time now as to whether or not that's really valuable for our society. And I'm right in there somewhere. I grew up thinking one thing, and then I had a life-altering experience, and now I look at the world very differently.
I think that's really interesting, because I think probably a lot of practitioners working in the criminal justice system don't spend so much time thinking about white-collar crime. They're very immersed in thinking about violent crime or sexual crime. And I suppose as a society, we're often quite guilty of judging situations and people on face value, aren't we? So I've spoken before about a social worker who said he couldn't believe that somebody had experienced abuse because the family were a nice middle class family who gave him tea and biscuits when he arrived. In a way, I guess people kind of like look at people who are high functioning and have managed to get through education and have a career, and it becomes hard to see how they might have their own vulnerability, whereas somebody who's causing fights in the pub, for instance, people can get that he's got a problem with anger management, and maybe there's some reason for that. So it's interesting to hear you give that perspective. I wondered, Jeff, whether had you resolved your opioid addiction before you went to prison, or did you receive any treatment for that while you were in prison, or was it just a case of having to just get on with it and go cold turkey?
Well, I am now over 19 years clean and sober, and I never touched another drink or illicit drug after once I entered rehab a little over 19 years ago. So I would say that the greatest success of anything that I've achieved in my life in terms of before or in my comeback story since, getting and staying sober is the singular most important thing that I've done. I went to prison almost 4 years sober. And so to have had the lessons and the teachings of recovery, and to be able to walk erect and walk into prison as a sober man was very different experience than most people who go to prison who have drug and alcohol problems, because they're generally drinking and drugging right up to the prison door. And maybe they have to go through withdrawal in prison. And what I've learned is that if you want alcohol or drugs, you can get them in prison as well. I didn't know that. But I was never tempted by it. One of the reasons is that there were drug and alcohol programs in prison. Specifically, there were there was actual programming in the prison itself, and also there were Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous meetings in prison. So I met a lot of other sober people, but you would think in a compound of 1,500 men that there would be more than just 30 people in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, but yet that's how many were there. So I guess that's 2%, if I'm doing my math right. And of everyone who was in that meeting the first day that I went, so it was me and about 30 other men, not one of them had spent 1 day sober on the street. So they had all gotten sober in prison. And many of them were drinking and drugging in prison. So their length of sobriety was less than their imprisonment. And so I was able to talk to them about staying sober outside of prison. They were able to talk to me about staying sober inside of prison. So it was it was kind of a positive sum game in terms of the value add that we gave to one another. And again, that's something else that I was able to bring to my later work, because it was very enlightening.
Thank you. And how about addressing the criminal behaviour that had taken you into prison? Are there treatment programs for white-collar crime in the US? You know, were you expected to evidence any reduction in risk, or is there an assumption that, unlike other crimes, that prison is an effective way of treating it?
Another topic that would be an entire podcast. The two reasons for incarceration, the so-called reasons, the reasons that are given for incarceration, are for rehabilitation and deterrence. So the question is there adequate rehabilitation in the community that the court system can look to so that they would potentially give lenient or diversionary sentencing, so that you could continue to improve therapeutically or improve your way of life outside of prison? And the answer is, while I was going through it, the answer is no. There certainly was for drug and alcohol. And the fact that I was so committed to recovery and I had been so successful in my drug and alcohol recovery was a reason that the judge gave me a downward departure and gave me less prison time that he would have otherwise given me. But as to the ethical components, the answer is no. And that's one of the reasons why we started a white-collar support group, certainly a ministry to support white-collar criminals. So I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But in essence, what we've started is an ethics rehab. And that's to bring the experience that some of us have had in drugs and alcohol, but apply it specifically to this group of people who have white-collar criminal justice issues, or perhaps other ethical breaches that have led them to consequences. For example, there are people who lose their law licenses or lose their medical licenses or their ability to transact financial transactions in the stock market, but don't go to prison. So there are regulators who perhaps will terminate people's licenses, and that's not strictly a criminal justice issue. So could we influence some of those outcomes by early interventions, by helping people look closely at their ethical transgressions and work with them on it? Well, we've been doing this project for 7 or 8 years, and I know that there are other similar projects, not quite the same, but similar, in Spain and in Australia. I'm in touch with a group in Australia that runs one where they actually have an ethics oath that they ask business people and corporations to subscribe to. And I think that's brilliant. Do I think that it's easier in a country like Australia that has a much smaller and coalesced community than we have here in the US, which is obviously much larger and much more disparate? And probably, but I think the concept itself is brilliant. And so we are working towards acceptance, where if we are able to show positive outcomes, then perhaps we can get prosecutors and judges to align where it makes more sense to have people get community-based treatment than it does treatment in prison, especially since there is almost no treatment in prison. And we think we're on the precipice of that, but that still could be years.
I'm not that surprised that you've given that answer, because I think that kind of fits with the bulk of what's offered for just criminal, within the criminal justice system in Britain. It seems to be organised around the kinds of offence, and is quite superficial, quite symptom focused, treating the offending behaviour as if it's a symptom. I mean,
Yes.
Both David and I have worked in very different services where there's work is at a deeper level to resolve feelings like, the need to belong and be able to relate to other people, to develop feelings of self-worth and be able to accept boundaries in a different way. But that isn't commonplace, and certainly we would have never had, in the project that I worked on, someone who'd come for white collar crime, because those projects tend to be expensive and therefore aimed at people who are considered to be very dangerous.
Well, even here in the States, most of the white collar research is done in recidivism-based work. And there is an extensive body of white collar research as to recidivism, which is kind of strange in a way, because there's very low recidivism rates, mostly because people who have committed or been convicted of these crimes don't have the access to the fiduciary or financial resources that they had in the first place when they started. But to make the jump from recidivism research into program research or prophylactic research, that's a big jump for people to fund. I mean, obviously that the grant money has to be there in order to fund the researchers. So that's another thing that we're working on, and you can see the nexus between the research that's currently there, and then how that would relate to the building of program, but it's not there yet.
And beyond the question of kind of like social ethics, for instance, are there any other kind of like common treatment needs for white collar criminals that the criminal justice systems perhaps should be addressing, either in or outside of prison? Maybe in the community might be a more appropriate place given the low level of dangerousness. But are there other common treatment needs that you see? I mean,
well, certainly I think the right answer to that is that there are treatment needs for that community, because there's treatment needs for everybody. We live in a society of people who are woefully short on the right kind of character and attitudes. But do I realistically think that we're going to make major inroads? I think only if we are able to get, say, only if we're able to get corporations, universities involved, and they take this on as a mission. Because here's an example. If I were to speak, this past week I spoke in front of 500 bankers and trust officers and trust attorneys before a bankers association, and they were very receptive. It went very, very well. But these are fiduciaries. These are people who are paid to be the shepherds of other people's money. But if I went to speak to, say, the freshman class at Goldman Sachs, or a large financial, a hedge fund, or a large financial institution, and I got up in front of that room, and I looked at the 500 brand new stockbrokers or traders or hedge fund managers, and I looked at them and I said to them, 2% of you, and I'm just picking a number off the top of my head, but 2% of you are going to be prosecuted in the next 5 years. And so let me tell you what that means. I think that the attraction to the benefits, the risk reward ratio is such that very few of them would be able to look at themselves and be able to say, well, I'm someone who's susceptible to that kind of behavior, or I might be at risk, and therefore I'm going to modify my behavior. I mean, they're all there because they want to make a lot of money, and they understand that it's an inherently risky business. They trade on a lot of things, including secrets, I would imagine, and I just don't know what the impact is. But if the company itself decided that we are going to train up our people to walk a more narrow path, and that we think that we run a risk, the company runs a risk of scrutiny if we fail to do it. So this is really beyond compliance. This is not having a company responsible or accountable for individual transactions. This is this is a philosophy. There's a gestalt involved in all of this that companies could take on and say, we want to improve our company, we want to improve an entire industry, and we think that by doing that, what we can do is we could improve the world. And I wish they would, and I'm hoping they will.
There's a real shrewdness about that as well, isn't there? I was just thinking, it reminded me of a colleague of mine, Des McVeigh, who was doing some teaching in a secure psychiatric hospital and said, the chances are statistically that one of you is here because they want to sexually abuse the patients. Mm-hmm. And there was absolute horror that this had been spoken, and people became quite angry at it being said. But it's like, actually, if you can't entertain the idea that that's possible, then how are you going to protect the patients? Because you're already approaching it from the assumption that it's not going to happen. And in a way, I think you're describing something quite similar. You have to be open to the idea that actually it's inevitable that some of the people in the room are going to find themselves falling foul of the law, and only by accepting that can you then put in place things to protect. But I was also struck when in your first answer to David, when you spoke about having represented people who'd committed white-collar crime. And I suppose one of the things that we sometimes talk about is the idea of contamination, that in a way that if you're working with something that's kind of like from the more darker side of life, that there can be a desensitization to it or contamination. And I wondered if you felt that had contributed to your offending in any way.
Probably. I think it was subconscious. I think that, but I wasn't in the kind of environment where making money was the overt reason for the business. So I was representing people who were having problems, or I was representing people who had transactions, but my business itself wasn't the business of making money. If I was in a business it was a single bottom line business, and for example, a financial institution, and so there were 1,000 people on a trading floor, and the question would be, am I doing anything differently than anyone else is doing, from the person next door is doing? And that might desensitize. That might create an incentive to look for the most expeditious way of getting to the result, as opposed to what's the best way. But let me give you an example. I had a friend client a bunch of years ago when I was still practicing law. Well, I'm practicing law again now, you know that. But and what he was the second best performing international bond fund in the world in that year. So, of course, he had offers all over the world to come bring his algorithm. He was a Chicago School of Economics graduate and a mathematical expert. And so he was hired by a bank in London, and he moved his family from the U.S. to London. And he was managing their fund, their own fund. So he wasn't managing outside money; he was managing the bank's fund. And he went to make transactions based upon his algorithm, and he was locked out of the transactions. So he went to the higher ups in the bank, very well known UK bank, by the way, and they said to him, "Well, you can't make those transactions. We've been doing business with those firms for 300 years." And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, our philosophy is to encourage and to maintain relationships with these companies for hundreds of years, which of course is not the way it works in the U.S. In the U.S., it's based upon quarterly performance." So what he found was that his way of doing business was essentially valueless within that construct. I think that if we moved from short-term profitability to long-term success, our whole world would shift, but certainly our need to cut corners and perhaps what we consider to be white-collar crime would no longer be such a part of the carrot, and we'd be more into the stick than the carrot.
That's a really interesting comment on the whole economic system, I think, here, Jeff. You're talking really about a kind of failed pseudo-capitalist system.
Yes.
Anyway, thanks very much for that. That will also generate a lot of thought, I think. So, Jeff, when you left prison, you went on and trained as a religious minister. Were
Yes.
you particularly religious before you went to prison? Had that given you great sort of succor whilst you were inside?
Well, I'm Jewish. I was raised Jewish. I did find in prison a different kind of faith and connection to God than I had ever experienced in my life, and also exposure to a lot of different religions. And I'd attended a lot of different kinds of services. When I came out, I was looking for a more spiritual path and a path devoted to service. And I didn't know that I was going to apply to seminary and I was going to become a reverend or much less an ordained reverend. But it seemed to fit with both my faith journey, my embrace of Christianity as a not just viable, but also personal, personal faith in that, and also a path to the kind of service and goodness that I wanted to use to be kind of the outreach of my worldview, and it worked. I did become a working reverend for a few years, quite a few years actually, maybe 5 years, and that's what led to founding the ministry to support white-collar criminals and their families, which was the first of its kind in the country. As it turns out, it was the first of its kind in the world, And as far as I know, no one else has ever done it. And probably because there's no financial incentive to do it. But it made me and my wife, who founded it with me, my wife Lynn, my second wife, it made us feel good. And that was much more important than chasing money. And so we did that for quite a few years, and it led us on to speaking tours and guest preaching in churches and in synagogues, and doing a lot of kind of nonprofit / religious work. And then about 3.5 years ago, when I saw what the hole was in the needs of people who were going through white-collar criminal justice issues, because they certainly needed spiritual support and emotional support, and they needed practical experience kind of advice. But mostly what they needed, or in addition, what they needed was they needed lawyers to trust, and lawyers that who understood where they were. The white-collar bar is not dedicated to that. I mean, it's dedicated to getting the best sentence possible, or the best criminal justice sentence possible. And some of them do a brilliant job at that, and some of them don't. Like in any other business, some people are good at it, and some people aren't. But it was kind of luck of the draw who any particular defendant was finding to represent him. And also, those lawyers were not dedicated toward the long-term success of the defendants, because the criminal justice matter is one of many issues that they're going through. They're going through financial issues and marital issues and perhaps business dissolution issues and all kinds of different issues that are going to last maybe a decade or more. And so at the termination of the criminal justice issue, at the disposition of that issue, they're left adrift, perhaps going to prison, perhaps not. And then who's minding the store? Who's helping them through all the rest of these issues? So I thought, I might be able to add some value there, not just because I was a former lawyer and a former general counsel kind of lawyer, and someone who'd been through recovery and reentry and had been a working minister, but my skill set was fine-tuned to be able to do that. So I applied for reinstatement to the bar in the state of New York in the U.S., and that gauntlet lasted for about 3 years. And in May of this year, I was reinstated to the bar. So I am a working lawyer representing people going through crisis situations, and also still a minister. And the combination is just exactly how I want to spend the rest of my life.
Thank you. So is the ministry that you were describing earlier, is that the progressive prison ministries? It
is. And I would say that the thing that we are most known for is the white-collar support group that we run.
Right.
So on Monday nights on Zoom, we have a support group, and we've had people from all over the world. We've had almost 400 members of it now. And they're in isolation, kind of in little boxes on a screen, kind of like we all go through now, like we're doing right now, by the way. And we were just early adopters of the technology because we were forced to, because white-collar crime is non-geographic. It's not like in an AA room where everyone from a neighborhood or a community would meet in a church basement. Here we're spread out all over the country and all over the world. And so this coming Monday night is our 280th weekly meeting. So we've been doing it for 5.5 years.
That's fantastic. And of course, what you've done there also is you've highlighted the differential, the difference for people. So you're talking about, individuals who are actually living fairly isolated lives, and Zoom is a kind of connection for them. Whereas for us, for Naomi and us, and me, meeting you is a real opportunity and a pleasure, which we wouldn't be able to do without this technology.
Thank you. I think it's a pleasure for everyone in the white collar support group, because just imagine living in the kind of isolation where not only have your friends and family and business community abandoned you, but realistically, probably not even your spouse understands what you're going through. Maybe you don't understand what your spouse is going through, but your spouse doesn't understand what you go through. And perhaps your attorney has told you, has advised you not to speak to anybody. So here we have a community of people who find a real richness and love for one another. And that's also led us to in-person meetings and retreats and celebrations. And I travel around the U.S. I haven't traveled internationally, so it's mostly because of the pandemic. But for example, I'll go into a city, and I'll meet with 9 of our support group members, and it's the first time we've ever met, even though we may have known each other for years. And just to be able to actually give each other hugs and to kind of feel the closeness and the bond that we all feel of going through this common issue is just, it's beautiful and something that was quite unexpected when we started.
So, you've been a very busy person, Jeff. You've done a tremendous amount in these last years, because you've made the massive adjustment from being and coming out of prison. You founded the Progressive Prison Ministries, which you're still operating.
Yes.
And you're now also an active lawyer. And something I hadn't quite understood when we began was that you've converted from your original faith to the Christian faith. So it's been a massive period of transition for you.
Well, I consider myself a double belonger. I'm a Jew and a Christian, and I'm comfortable with that. I didn't coin that phrase, by the way. And I'm comfortable with that. I think that we live in a kind of a non-binary world right now. Certainly, in form of religion, I don't think I think it's personal, and for me, I'm connected to the entire trajectory of the Judeo-Christian experience, in both in my training and in my heart.
Thank you, Naomi.
Yeah, I think we're probably just at the final question, really, I think, which is, we always ask our guests how they cope with the impact of being in prison, but you seem to have really thrived as a consequence. And you can hear, as you're talking about, when you were talking about prison, the fact that you found a community, and also talking about the beauty of the people in there, you can really see that there was something about connecting at a deep level with people. But I wonder what enabled you to transform such a deep personal crisis into something you could grow from. Was it primarily these relationships, or is there something about you, do you think, that enabled you to really take this as an opportunity?
Well, let me be clear. As a criminal justice advocate, I believe in less prison. The fact that I thrived, and there's many people who do thrive and grow and succeed, is largely some kind of amorphous, non-describable inner drive. It's not like the programs are there generally. For me, I never saw another option. I don't really know what drove me to go to law school in the first place, other than that was the only option I saw. When I was in prison and coming out of prison, the only thing I could see was move forward, see where God takes me, and kind of have the the daily experience or the daily understanding that anywhere is better than where I am right now. I probably don't agree with that any longer, but at the time I did. So therefore, take a step. And whatever direction I go in, the next day I wake up and I'm in a different place. And so step by step, day by day, that serpentine path led me basically to find all kinds of things and have vistas I never would have been able to see had I not done that. That's what I suggest to anybody who's going through any kind of personal crisis, that don't be limited by what you can see right now. Certainly, you can have the faith that a month from now or 6 months from now, you'll see things differently. It's not dissimilar from walking in the woods. You can be in the woods on a trail and it's heavily forested, and then all of a sudden you just round the corner and there's the most amazing view, the most amazing vista. And I didn't do that. God did that. I'm just walking on the path long enough to have seen it. So I think that if there's one takeaway, certainly that's a takeaway for anyone listening here, that you're not limited by what you think is going on right now. The world is out there, and the world of opportunity is out there, and it's only our own shame and our own prisons of self that prevent us from moving forward.
Really great words of advice there, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Jeff. It's been a real pleasure meeting and having this conversation with you.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful experience. I just want to let people know, if they want to find the ministry, it's at prisonist.org. That's prisonist like feminist, prisonist.org. And if you want to reach out to me at the law firm, that's grantlaw.com.
And we'll put links in our notes to those things so that people can easily find them.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really interesting to hear the account of someone who'd committed a white-collar crime compared. It's so different to most of the work that we end up doing in prison and psychiatric hospitals. So to hear about a very different kind of offending was fascinating. And I thought there was something really humble about the way Jeff spoke about his experiences and his way of managing to appreciate and value the people that he'd encountered whilst he was in prison.
Yeah, I agree. I thought Jeff came across really strongly and clearly, and he said a number of things which, as he pointed out, would have made interesting podcasts in their own right. But there were kind of three things in particular I wanted to highlight. I thought that his description of his pathway into his offending was really clear and powerful, so that it came across as being both kind of inevitable and easy. And of course both of those things require further kind of thought about how they might be kind of combated. The second thing I really liked was his description of the prison as being a community of people who were just trying to survive. I thought that was really powerful. And then thirdly, his overall message was of hopefulness. I thought hopefulness that people could actually change their direction of life no matter what difficulties they got themselves into.